Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I'll be discussing the famous Destroyer book series, which is one of the biggest hits of the so-called boom in men's adventure fiction in terms of the paperbacks of the 70s and 80s. And what made the Destroyer notable is that really it was a complete send-up of everything that was popular about the sort of long-running series that really got started with the Executioner or Mac Bolan series. Most people, and myself included, were introduced to the whole idea of the Destroyer through the 1985 film adaptation, Remo Williams' The Adventure Begins. This will give you a general idea of the overall setup and is an okay film for what it is. I think the best aspect of that film is how it really gets the dynamic of the lead characters across in terms of their amusing eternal bickering with one another. So that film, of course, featured Fred Ward as the title character of Remo Williams, aka the Destroyer, but also the iconic and immortal Chiun, his master, played by Joel Grey in the film, who is the teacher and master of the art of Sinanju, which goes far beyond being just the ultimate of martial arts. The series having the sort of satirical element is picked up on some in the film, but essentially the film is really just a taster for what the series could contain, because I don't know if any feature film could quite get as wacky and over the top as some of the books in the series get. And even the books with a lower key story are still full of wacky over the top moments and set pieces and beats of action and things that you can't quite believe what you're reading. These books are also not really for the faint of heart in terms of they really sort of take aim at making fun of or criticizing every aspect of society, which also means they sort of take aim at all political views as well. They've been rather influential on a number of different people. I know Shane Black is a confirmed fan and tried to get a Destroyer film made, and even worked with the primary of the co-writers of the series, Warren Murphy, on several films. In terms of tone and how over the top these can get, and how they basically try to mess around with everything they can. Nothing is really sacred in a Destroyer book. It's going to get mocked or ridiculed or torn apart or blown to smithereens. I think the closest comparison would be some of the more over-the-top South Park episodes, or how ridiculous and wild South Park can get, even though it's ostensibly just a comedy. Well, just imagine that in the guise of being a long-running men's adventure paperback series. And you start to get the idea. This wasn't something that immediately was there in the first couple books. It's something that had to grow and develop over time. The series itself started in the early 70s, and the co-writers were, of course, Richard Sapir and Warren Murphy, who started out in the field of journalism. I think they both worked for newspapers for a good number of years, and they sort of fell into the publishing racket and decided they were going to try their hand at a men's adventure story. The first two books in the Destroyer series really aren't quite the sort of Destroyer experience. It's really book 3, Chinese Puzzle, where the bickering dynamic between Remo Williams and his ancient, forever cranky master Chiun starts to come to the surface. But the first two books were essentially generated out of an old plot concept that they had, and a book that was never really published. And then once those were out, it seems to have morphed when the authors, I think, got the idea that we can't really take this stuff seriously, and we think it would be better if we just started, poking fun at it and playing around with the concept of an adventure paperback series and the increasingly ridiculous exploits our hero character gets up to. And so this would start to build, and basically starting with book 3 all the way to the real end of the original series with Murphy's death in 2015, you have, roughly over 150 volumes of this series with the most out there, over-the-top elements you could never even begin to conceive, because you start a Destroyer novel and you're just in for the ride. I will say again that these books are not really for the faint of heart. Some do definitely contain plots and certain elements that are certainly cringe-inducing in places. They are from the 70s men's adventure paperback boom, but they are also sort of dabbling in areas that, I mean, you can get where the authors were going in certain cases, but the fact that they're basically sort of satirizing everything means that you're going to pick up a destroyer, and every once in a while you're going to have your feathers ruffled a little bit, or you might cringe here and there. And unfortunately, some of the books, especially the earlier ones that I've read, do contain some elements that are more than a bit dicey, and I did read some of those earlier in my sort of journey into trying the Destroyer series, and for a little while it made me wonder if maybe I should just not continue with this. But there's a certain point where I think the series hits its stride. Another factor that causes the Destroyer novels to have basically a different style and approach and differing levels of effectiveness is that the co-authors, I think, started to maybe get a little bit bored here and there. And so Richard Sapir didn't work on some books. Some books were written by Warren Murphy solo. Then there were a variety of ghostwriters who eventually started coming in. So you have to basically look at each book and try to figure out who actually wrote it. Was it both of the original co-creators? Was it just one of them? Because Sapir would basically leave and come back to the series multiple times. And then other ghostwriters would come in and work with Warren Murphy. Some were eventually written by the ghostwriters entirely. One of the ghostwriters was also Murphy's wife, which I find rather interesting, and it's nice to see that they could collaborate. And then eventually one of the primary ghostwriters, who actually wound up writing a big chunk of the series pretty consecutively, was actually Will Murray, the great comics and pulp writer, and pretty much the world's premier pulp fiction historian in terms of the classical pulp heroes from the pulp magazine era, and also really the keeper of the flame in terms of Doc Savage fiction, as he's done so many wonderful Doc Savage stories, in addition to his incredible histories of pulp characters like his books on the Shadow. So when I figured that out, that made me all the more interested to read more in the Destroyer series. So the plot setup, for those who are unfamiliar with the Destroyer himself, the lead character, is Remo Williams, who began life as a New Jersey cop, and then he was framed for a crime that he didn't commit and sentenced to die in the electric chair. Just before this, he's approached by a mysterious individual while waiting on death row, and given a sort of choice that isn't very well explained what that choice is. He essentially then awakens after his execution and has been given a new face, and will now be trained as the lone operative of the secretive Cure organization. Now, this organization was set up by an acting president. It's never expressly said, but it's very much indicated that it was supposedly JFK himself who created this organization to sort of safeguard the ideals of the Constitution of the United States, and basically in a lot of ways be a sort of troubleshooting arm to deal with internal domestic problems that basically fell outside the areas that could be handled by the standard law enforcement and intelligence organizations. So this is basically an off-the-books black ops group that operates under its own authority. So interestingly, there are a number of safeguards to keep this organization from ever amassing too much power or not having a sort of system of checks and balances. These are all essentially under one man, the head of Cure, Harold W. Smith, who Remo always refers to as Smitty and constantly tries to get under his skin because they act like they can't stand each other, but they really kind of develop a begrudging respect. Smith is a very nondescript character, very much a sort of, on the surface, one who might seem like a sort of office man or a bureaucrat in ways, but takes his job very seriously and never wants to overstep his bounds. And if Cure is ever discovered or shut down, there are elaborate procedures always set up to essentially wreck the works and their information gathering technology. And Smith will be, of course, tasked with eliminating Remo and committing suicide to cover up anything. The only communication that is had with the acting president is basically a secret phone somewhere in the Oval Office where they can make a call that they don't really know much about. They're basically kept in the dark, but it's essentially their Hail Mary to deal with any sort of problem. They make a call, and Smith answers it inside the Cure headquarters, which is actually inside the Fulcroft Mental Institution, where that's essentially the cover, and inside is actually contained the massive amount of computers and other technology that is constantly searching for and gathering information to assist on Cure cases. Now, Remo Williams is the only operative of Cure, and you might think, well, why would you have a secret organization designed to combat against all sorts of problems with only one operative? Well, that's because Remo is trained by the master of Sinanju himself, Chiun, to be the world's greatest martial artist and essentially one-man army. Well, I should say world's second greatest, because no one is as great as the master of Sinanju, and to say any different would probably mean that Chiun would be very displeased and probably kill you. Because that's just his disposition. Chiun is really the highlight of the books and is inherently hysterical, as he is a aged Korean master of this mystical art form that's referred to generally as the original of martial arts, but really Sinanju, as it is used in these books, eventually becomes... I mean, the easiest way to describe it is that Remo and Chiun basically act like they have force powers. Can do virtually anything, and stop bullets in midair, and essentially Remo is trained to the point where he is a one-man army and can be sent into almost any situation and has practically superhuman abilities, as does Chiun, and this basically makes them sort of outsiders and not as well able to connect with the rest of society, so all they do is spend time with each other and constantly get on each other's nerves, and the sort of crankiest father-son dynamic that fiction has ever seen. Their constant bickering really is the charm of the books, and this really starts in book 3 to a small degree, and it builds so that when you get to the later books, really the reason why you pick up a Destroyer book is for more bickering between Remo Williams and Chiun, and what sort of crazy antics are they going to get up to, and also to see the ridiculousness of the plot that unfolds, and also to see how high the body count gets, because it can get quite massive. Once the books really hit their stride, typically there's an opening chapter, and then chapter 2 will always start with some form of the line, "His name was Remo," and then we get a sort of introductory sequence with whatever Remo is doing, whatever task he's been given, or whatever mischief Chiun is getting into, and we'll have one sort of really over-the-top opening set piece, almost like a pre-title sequence, even though it's chapter 2 coming after the sort of introduction to what will be the book's plot. And there are certain little conceits like that will link the books together, certain series cliches that emerge that become entertaining enough. And then you also have Remo's catchphrase, typically done when handling the final villain before they're dispatched, or after somebody dies. The catchphrase is, "That's the biz, sweetheart." It sounds weird at first, but reading it in print and figuring out the context of it, it starts to grow on you. I think it's one of the signature sort of one-liner catchphrases associated with a particular character in the action genre. So once you get to a certain point, I think the series starts to really emerge. So I would say from books 20 onward, roughly, from the ones that I've read, is really where things get up to full steam, and they're fully on board with the crazy over-the-top antics and the full satirization of the men's adventure style. If Chiun, Master of Sinanju, did not sound interesting enough as the world's deadliest and also crankiest man in all of existence, existence. His hobbies are famous because Chiun hates virtually everything except his beloved soap operas. He loves soap operas so much so that when Remo and Chiun are abroad, he constantly has to have tapes made of the soap operas that he's missing and then sent to wherever they are in the world. This would, of course, develop over time, but that is essentially his one pastime. And, of course, this is the type of character that whenever they go somewhere, even though Chiun is able to virtually do anything and doesn't even eat all that much because he is essentially a superhuman character, he travels with ornate luggage and, of course, like 20 different pieces of a matching set of oversized ornate luggage just because, that's just how he rolls, essentially. If that was not striking and odd enough for this sort of character, he's also a giant fan of Barbra Streisand, so there's this incredible wackiness in the hobbies of one of the main characters. But it's not all fun and games, as throughout the series, Remo will essentially express how his training in Sinanju and his experiences working for Cure have basically made him feel almost like a non-entity. He has to remember his past life and basically simple pleasures such as eating, because the Sinanju training not only forbids the use of weapons, so Remo doesn't actually kill anybody with guns. It's all done with hands, but they also do not eat certain things, and so it's a very Spartan lifestyle that's imposed. And then some books, of course, get into the other staple of men's adventure fiction, which is, of course, love interests and sex scenes, and that's not really a large factor in the Destroyers because the Sinanju training in Remo has essentially almost turned off his ability to be able to relate to women in that way. And in some moments, it's actually said that he has great knowledge in being able to give pleasure to others but can receive none himself. And it's little moments like that throughout the Destroyers that actually ground the stories. And I think the writing in the best of the books actually has that, even for some of the side characters or characters exclusive to those particular stories. So it's quite striking that when you read enough of these that you can start to pick up on grounding elements that actually give you something to latch onto and indicate there are, negative connotations in all of this and moments that aren't so completely wacky and over the top and I can't believe what I'm reading. And it's that I think really helps to cement some sort of foundation for the reader, because otherwise the events in some of these books get so over the top and wacky, and some of the characters and villains that are in these books are just, they just have to be read to be believed. I have to also admit that since this series started in the 1970s and has the bickering father-son dynamic, and the best way to describe Chiun essentially would be, just imagine if Yoda just killed everybody and loved soap operas and was always cranky. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if George Lucas had read a couple of Destroyers at some point when he was developing Star Wars throughout many years in the 1970s, as there's definitely a tinge of the dynamic of teacher-student relationship between Yoda and Luke Skywalker in The Empire Strikes Back, in the teacher-student relationship of Chiun, Master of Sinanju, and Remo Williams. There have been a number of attempts to adapt the series into other media since the 1985 film. That film in particular was supposed to start a whole series of Destroyer films, but it wasn't really that successful at the box office, so that didn't happen. I do think the film is good for what it is and its lower budget. It gets the basic ideas across, and the casting in terms of the leads is really well done because they do get the characterizations right. But it's, again, basically just a tiny taster of what the books are actually like. I don't know if it's possible to get the entirety of one Destroyer book into a 90 to 100 minute movie and also not have the audience just completely be baffled by what they're witnessing. There was a made-for-television follow-up, essentially what is a sort of TV movie. I think it was maybe intended for being a pilot for a proposed series, where Roddy McDowall played Chiun, and it was basically a follow-up to the 1985 film. But outside of that, the plans for a feature film have been in development hell on and off ever since. And I think the last that's been said is that they're trying to do it as perhaps a TV series again. There was an attempt to do the Destroyer in comics, and the main sort of run was done by Marvel in the early 90s. I've got a couple issues of this series, and it's actually really well done and very entertaining. Mostly they're adapting some of the Destroyer book plots, but there are some original stories, and not only is the art very good, but the tone is spot on. Both Remo and Chiun are represented very well in terms of the characterizations, and most, if not all of these, I think, were actually written by Will Murray. So if you're curious about the Destroyer, you can actually look at some of the Marvel comics from the early 90s, and they're actually not too terribly expensive, so I've been able to pick up a few issues. So I've read a number of Destroyers now, so what I'll do is basically do a mini review of the ones that I read in the order that I read them, just so you can get a sort of feeling for the experience of what it's like just picking up a random book in the series, or perhaps where you might want to start. So I found the best of the Destroyer collection in one of my local bookstores a little while ago. This is a 2007 omnibus that brings together books 3, 12, and 20 into a nice oversized trade paperback volume. The art is a little bit on the generic side, and the logo is sort of updated to match the modern books that were being done, as there is actually a couple different slight spin-off series because they had to continue the Destroyer series, but I think they switched publishers, and because these were still being done. And in fact, I think even after Warren Murphy's death in 2015, there have been some more Destroyer books written by others, and there's now also a nice new short story compilation or short story volume from Bold Venture Press that I'd like to check out. This is a nice way to get 3 Destroyer books, and there's a little custom introduction from Warren Murphy. These were books that have been reprinted under the sort of author's choice line. Some of the paperbacks had that sort of distinction in terms of the ones that were deemed more important or more popular, so some books are easier to find than others. It also includes that introduction from that special reprinting, which is really great because it actually concludes with a fictional introduction from Chiun himself, basically insulting both authors for getting things wrong and the publisher, and saying that only he could write an actual introduction. So that little bit there, if that doesn't sort of tickle your fancy or give you an idea of what you can actually expect in a Destroyer book, then basically if that little conceit of having the cranky master of Sinanju himself writing his own sort of snarky introduction, then these may not be for you, essentially. So the first book in the volume is indeed Book 3, Chinese Puzzle, which is typically regarded as where the series truly starts. The first 2 books don't really have all the elements in place, and Book 3 is where we first have Remo and Chiun going off on some sort of adventure and basically bickering with one another. But I will say that you can definitely feel there's growing pains that are still happening. The earlier books that I've read in the series don't feel as well written and do really make your attention wander. They do get better quite quickly, but I think you can definitely feel that in some, and especially here in Book 3. I read this and it wasn't really grabbing my attention, so I wondered if the series would get any better. The plot is actually about a visiting Chinese general who is in the United States on a sort of diplomatic tour, and he gets kidnapped by forces that are trying to cause tension between China and the United States. There are some topical references to the time, so this is basically set in when it was published around 1972. It's an okay read, but again, I think you can very much get the feeling that it's still rough around the edges. It should also be said that the Destroyers, particularly the earlier books, are not politically correct at all, which I think you should expect that going in. But that does mean you will hit certain elements that are on the more cringe-inducing side or very much show that they're of their time. But here in Chinese Puzzle, there's a moment where there's a female character who's introduced to essentially coerce her into not just really cooperating, but sort of not causing them any trouble. It's a very disquieting scene where essentially our hero character has his way with her, and to come across a rape scene in a book like this, it just really took me out of the whole book experience, and it was one of the aspects that made me think that, maybe this wasn't the series for me and I didn't really want to continue with it. That was the major element that made me dislike the book. I think as an early book and the first one that really starts establishing the satirical elements, the bickering between Remo and Chiun, and really trying to push the humor element. It's important for that, but you can definitely get the sense that it's still not quite fully formulated, and there are some elements that are extraordinarily distasteful. So then I pushed ahead and decided to see if I enjoyed the next book, which is book 12 and is entitled Slave Safari. This is one of the ones that, if you read reviews, you'll see that it definitely has some negative connotations. The plot really doesn't make any sense, but it brings Remo and Chiun to a country in Africa where there's some political machinations going on, but really they're there to investigate a series of disappearances where women, especially of a higher class or aristocratic women, are disappearing in America and turning up in Africa, usually dead and horribly mutilated. And this is basically because they're sold into prostitution or far worse. And there are some extraordinarily graphic sequences describing violence against women that is just really unpleasant and just felt extraordinarily distasteful. So that, combined with some inherent racism in terms of how the characters will talk in this book, means that it's not a very pleasant reading experience. The one thing I will say in terms of the only real positive I experienced in this book is that the writing is better and it does flow much better, and you also have even more of the humor that's starting to come in book 3, and the actual feats that Remo does are getting more and more superhuman. In fact, those are the only enjoyable parts of the book, particularly towards the end when he's making his way towards actually defeating the final villain. It's basically a series of things done to basically terrify all the villains, and they grow more and more ridiculous and over the top and superhuman. And one wishes that the book was just about that and didn't contain the extraordinarily distasteful elements. So this was another book that made me not really want to continue, and I actually had to think for a while if I wanted to push ahead and try book 3. Well, being as I'm a completist and I can't stand leaving something unfinished, I did, and I'm actually very glad I did, because book 3 in this collection is number 20, which is Assassin's Playoff. This was the book that made me go, okay, now I see what this series is really about. It didn't have any of the super distasteful elements, and it features the full force of the sort of macabre tinged dark humor that runs throughout all of these with increasingly ridiculous events. And it also has a recurring villain. The series would have a number of villains that came up in other books or would be recurring, but they are all fun and crazy and kind of kooky in their own way. Here, the villain, and this is apparently the last of his appearances, so I've got to find his earlier appearances in earlier volumes, but this is a villain who is actually the original trainee of Chiun and was supposed to be the heir to the throne of Sinanju, and basically turned evil once he had the incredible knowledge and was essentially a superpower in and of himself. But his name is Nuik. I don't even know how you pronounce it, but it's basically Chiun backwards. And as soon as I read that, and the whole book flowed nicely and had even more of the wackiness and satirical humor that I did actually enjoy in the previous 2 books and wanted more of, that's when I realized, okay, now this is actually working. So this is still the best of the Destroyer books that I've read, and if anyone is curious to try a Destroyer book, I think starting with Assassin's Playoff, book 20, is probably actually a great starting point, because it gives you arguably the most famous of the recurring villains, even though this is really his last appearance. It's a indescribably wacky, satirical, action-packed book, but it also has moments where our hero is brought back down to having mortal elements. I think some of the best Destroyer books are where the Sinanju training doesn't solve everything, or for various reasons, Remo actually loses some of those abilities and thus can be killed. So for me, this was the book that actually made the series make sense and made me want to continue. So if you get this particular volume to try the Destroyer out, I would say read Assassin's Playoff, and the other two are just sort of background to see how the series started, and also to see some of the more unfortunate elements that can creep into these. The next Destroyer book I read was from a great number of years later. So again, I'm basically going through my journey into reading random Destroyer books. So the next one I picked up was book 83, which is Skullduggery from 1991, credited as a super novel. And this is the sort of style the covers had changed over to by this point in the late 80s, early 90s. But this is actually a book that was ghostwritten entirely by Will Murray. And even if you didn't know that, you start reading this, and if you're a fan of the classic Pulp Fiction characters, or just pop culture in general, you'll notice that there are some really notable characters in this book, just not named because of rights and licensing, obviously. The plot starts with small events and builds to essentially being about a villain with a desire for world domination, and a whole plot to essentially sweep all of Asia with an army that he built up, and then obviously with the further goal to then take over the rest of the world. But the villain and the villain's henchmen should be very familiar in terms of the actions they have, or how they're described, because essentially this book is Remo and Chiun fighting the evil Fu Manchu, and his henchman is basically Bruce Lee in his Kato costume from the Green Hornet series, driving the Black Beauty. That's when I knew, okay, I got to figure out who actually wrote this, because I had no idea picking this up that I was going to be reading the Destroyer fighting Bruce Lee's Kato from the Green Hornet, driving the Black Beauty, and then eventually culminating in the Destroyer and Chiun having to fight Dr. Fu Manchu, who has history with Chiun, and Chiun and Fu Manchu essentially get into an arguing match. I had no idea going in that that was going to be in this book. And then when I found out it was actually written by Will Murray, that made it all make sense. Although I was clued in at the beginning, because there is an actual dedication to Van Williams, who of course played the Green Hornet in the television series. And then if that wasn't enough, there's a little note for sending something, if you wish, to the glorious house of Sinanju, complete with a P.O. box address. So this was essentially my second Destroyer reading experience, getting a taste of what the books were like by the early 1990s. And then when I found out Will Murray was writing all of them at this time, that piqued my interest further to try a few more. I tried a few more, 6 in fact. This will start to indicate that once you start reading Destroyer books, if you start to get on its weird and wacky wavelength, they become quite addictive, actually. They vary in their degrees of effectiveness in terms of, who the writer was and when it was written, but once you start, you can't stop. And that's something you'll see echoed in all the articles discussing the Destroyer online, in terms of what pops up when you just start researching the series. I've seen it described as the guiltiest of guilty pleasures in terms of reading, and that you not only can you not stop. There's one article I'll link to that actually describes it as being a reader of these books. If you had to tell the judge in a courtroom that just for the life of you, you can't stop. That's the thing. Once you read one that clicks with you, or tickles your fancy in that particular unique way, then you just have to keep going. So to go through these other 6 that I've read, I read these actually chronologically. So I picked up book 5 in the series, which is Dr. Quake. This is the uniform, slightly updated reprinting in terms of the cover art design, Basically, they would take the little bit of artwork that was on the earlier paperback and either repurpose it or redo it in the style to match the books they were doing around this point. So this is the reprinting with some nice enough artwork in pretty solid shape, and these also had some nice bold colors for the background so they stick out on the shelf. This being book 5 means it's an earlier book. It means you should expect some of the writing style and sort of growing pains I mentioned about book 3. This is thankfully much better than book 3 and doesn't have anything that's enormously distasteful like that book did. So I did enjoy this, as there was more of the humor that I expected from a Destroyer book. And the reason why I chose this is that the plot is about essentially someone being able to control and start earthquakes in California. And being a James Bond fan, that makes me think of course, the plot of A View to a Kill, with Zorin's plot to flood the San Andreas Fault and cause a giant earthquake. So I was curious to see if this was reminiscent of A View to a Kill at all. It's really not. The plot is not, shall we say, the greatest or the most consistent. It's more about the wacky things that happen on the journey to that point. But the overall conceit is unique enough. And also, people keep turning up dead, but in a horribly over-the-top gory way. They're essentially found almost torn apart from the insides, and it's revealed to essentially be that a prototype experimental water cannon was used on them, and they were essentially blown apart internally. If that wasn't weird enough, the basic sort of henchmen of the villain and really the sort of lead villains of the book are a pair of twin sisters who are described as being rather sort of like Valley Girls in a way, but also rather well endowed. So it's a sort of bizarre image of they're just going around killing people, and we're not quite sure where this is going for a lot of the book. And Remo is tasked with investigating by pretending to be a new businessman in the local area, and again, trying to figure out where the book is going is not going to help the reader, but there are enough standout moments and interesting bits. But in terms of A View to a Kill, the one moment that actually does make you think of the film is there's a particularly nasty death that happens in a car wash, and it's the old-fashioned car wash like the moment we see in the film. It's of course different. It's quite gory here in the book, so if you wanted a book with a really gory bit where somebody dies terribly in an old-fashioned car wash, then this is the book for you. The next I read was book 27, The Last Temple, from 1977. This is the original paperback printing with the style of the time, with the artwork, and as you can see, it is a book from 1977, so obviously the publishers didn't have an issue with putting a swastika on the actual cover. But this will give you an idea of what the original paperback printings look like in terms of this era of the series. Now, this book was actually quite interesting because while it has wacky and over-the-top elements, they're actually far less than usual. This is a pretty grounded story in terms of it being in Israel and dealing with the various conflicts going on at the time. The plot is essentially that of Remo and Chiun having to go to Israel and also work with local operatives to stop the efforts of a anti-Arab doomsday group that has stolen some nuclear devices and essentially explode them if things don't go their way. This becomes complicated because the nuclear weapons are essentially stolen and taken over by a group of former Nazis who have managed to survive by disguising themselves and changing their identities and faces and such, and they just want to destroy Israel itself. And the destroyer is the only one who can figure this out and stop it. The sort of wacky or over-the-top or striking elements are not, again, they're sort of dialed down. Really, the one thing that keeps happening for the first act of this book is that various individuals keep turning up dead, who sort of form the links to then explain what's going on. But they turn up dead, and in an extraordinarily gory touch, their limbs are cut off and formed into the shape of a swastika at the crime scene. So even in a book like this, where the sort of over the top elements are dialed down and it feels quite grounded, there are moments that are sometimes gory and sometimes really out there. But overall, it's quite surprising that this is actually pretty grounded. There is the banter between Remo and Chiun, and there is quite surprisingly a sort of satirical humor element in the climax, which involves a desperate bomb defusal. So this, I think, is sort of playing around with writing a more real world action adventure thriller, obviously with some cliched elements thrown in. It's obviously dated, but there wasn't anything in this that was, potentially offensive or anything. But it was interesting to see a Destroyer book that was, a bit grittier and had less of the sort of superhuman abilities and such. Then I read book 32 from 1978, which is Killer Chromosomes. Now, the cover image basically tells you what this book is about, which is a lady scientist basically working in what would now be sort of termed DNA or gene splicing, with sort of mixing animal and human elements. Basically takes her own experimental formula and becomes crazy tiger lady, who then is determined to sort of spawn a whole group of animal human hybrids and also eat people while trying to take over the world and find someone to mate with. That, of course, sounds completely wacky and silly and full of cliches and couldn't possibly be. This is ridiculously entertaining. I'll just go ahead and say it. As silly and preposterous as the plot sounds, and frankly really is, it actually works. This was the sort of moment where I realized, okay, if a series can make crazy man-eating tiger lady trying to create a whole race of animal-human hybrids and take over the world actually work, then I have to keep going. This is probably my second favorite of the Destroyer books I've read. It's actually, for what it is, it actually commits to the plot that it sets up. It's got a lot of inherent bits about satirizing the culture and battle of the sexes, and also the fashion and cosmetics industries, while also having our hero actually become wounded and essentially lose or temporarily not be able to rely on his Sinanju training. So here is a book where Remo Williams is essentially rendered mortal. And of course, crazy man-eating tiger lady decides he is the one she must mate with. So he does get kidnapped, leaving Chiun to figure out what to do to stop the potential takeover of the entire world by these increasing numbers of animal-human hybrids who essentially also have to feed on human flesh. So there's also a cannibalistic element there, which could be gross in the wrong hands, of course, but here the book's humor and how it basically skirts around some of this stuff and how it sets it up and how it has the characters established by at least retaining most of their essentially mental state before they were transformed. Again, this book actually manages to work. It's bizarre. It doesn't really have a sort of category you could put it in outside of just Destroyer. When you read a Destroyer book, it's hard to classify it as anything other than Destroyer. But the crazy man-eating tiger lady trying to take over the world with animal-human hybrids book actually works. And it's ridiculously entertaining, super pulpy, and just doesn't stop from the first page. So I couldn't believe that this book was enjoyable as it is with such a completely out there plot. But this is, again, probably my second favorite of the Destroyers I've read so far, and I would recommend this to anyone if this sounds even remotely interesting, or if you're just curious because it's so out there. It's out there, trust me. But, the stakes are quite high. There's a significant body count. Portions of cities get destroyed. There's a pretty high body count. But then also, again, I will say that there are moments of genuine human interaction here and there, especially with how the side characters and even the villain are first established and developed. And the ending has unexpected emotional quality to it. There's a plot twist at the very end that kind of comes up suddenly, but is so striking that it changes the whole dynamic and adds another dimension to this book that you didn't expect. And that's another thing that happens in the Destroyer series every once in a while, where there's some extra dimensionality to what would otherwise be indescribably wacky and all over the place. Next, I read book 39, which is Missing Link from 1980. This was written by Warren Murphy solo, from what I understand, and has a completely wacky plot premise in that the current president's brother-in-law is essentially a beer-guzzling moron who manages to also try to sell state secrets or things or act as if he can influence his brother-in-law for basically any sort of political faction or any other interest in the world. And then he gets kidnapped, and that essentially brings the Destroyer and Chiun into the case to try and find out what happened to the president's beer-guzzling moronic brother-in-law, who is, of course, named Bobby Jack. There are various parallels made to political figures at the time, and the president in this book, although not named, is very obviously supposed to be Jimmy Carter. This book has some complete wacky over-the-top moments. It has some good humor. It has some good Remo and Chiun moments that are very enjoyable, but it didn't really work for me. There are some moments that definitely felt like it didn't have the balance between poking fun at both sides of the political spectrum, and also the overall plot reveal is not very satisfying when you get to the end of it. There is, interestingly, a really strong female character introduced, midway through the book, who's essentially out for the same goal and a sort of competitor to Remo. And she's actually quite well developed and a nice character, but unfortunately the book doesn't really do much with her, and she's rather unfortunately wasted. So this is perhaps more of a middling book in terms of its effectiveness, although I will say in the end it does have the most striking death by third rail or electrocuted third rail of a train that I've ever experienced. So if you think you've seen every possible way a character could die by stepping on or coming into contact with an electrified third rail of like a subway or a train, read this book, because trust me, you've not seen it done this way, and it's so over the top and wacky and completely out there that it fits in the world of the Destroyer. Next, I read book 70 from 1987, which is The 11th Hour. This was apparently written by Warren Murphy, but then also with his wife Molly Cochran and Will Murray as well. So Will Murray basically started working as at least a partial ghostwriter or co-ghostwriter somewhere in the range of the books around this point, and that just sort of progressed with the next sort of volumes, and then eventually he just became the one writing them solo. But this book's plot is actually quite interesting. I think this is another of the better ones that I read. This book has someone trying to find out about the mysteries of Sinanju, which is actually a remote little village in Korea, and the historical story and what Chiun actually does as the master of Sinanju is sell his services the world over, of course, just working for Cure at this point, and send all the money back to support the small village and all its inhabitants. Well, someone gets the idea they're going to sneak in and try to videotape the Sinanju actual location and then try to turn it into some sort of big news story, and winds up finding out more than he expected. He then tries to sell this information to Soviet officials, and the official in charge decides he's going to try to use this for his own personal advancement. Meanwhile, Chiun is trying to get Remo to find a suitable mate so that the actual Sinanju line could actually continue, and that they could actually, ostensibly stop working for the Cure organization and end it entirely. This becomes even more of a factor as as it is found out that the Russians then actually learn about the Cure organization and what Remo and Chiun do, and that they're responsible for all these things that have happened after the past couple years, all the events in the past book. So it becomes a big political situation behind the scenes, and basically Cure has to be disbanded, and things go from there. And the finale of this book essentially has Remo going on a one-man mission to try and put everything back together, and of course get Chiun out of the depths of Moscow itself. So what starts small becomes quite big in terms of scale by the end. The book is packed with the father and son bickering dynamic of Remo and Chiun. There's a lot of different subplots going on, and everything gels nicely, and this is a really enjoyable read that, again, you can't quite classify as anything other than a Destroyer book. And then last, I read book 72 from 1988, entitled Soul Survivor. This does make some references to the events of book 70, since that basically sort of upset the whole balance, but it seems very quickly that they tried to return it to the status quo of Remo and Chiun carrying out actions for the Cure organization. But this was actually co-written by Warren Murphy with Will Murray again. The plot of this book brings back past characters for the last time, so this brings back the potential love interest of expert Soviet agent Anna Chutsov, and what turns out to be the recurring android villain of Mr. Gordon's. And if you thought this series wasn't wacky enough, Mr. Gordon's is one of the recurring villains, and I guess I should say it is an android intelligence that was actually originally developed by NASA, but was essentially primarily programmed by someone who had a drinking problem. So, of course, everything they did was named after alcoholic beverages, hence Mr. Gordon's. But essentially, this assumed sentience, and that everything else in all of existence should just be assimilated. And so this becomes a recurring threat in the Destroyer series, with the last appearance being here, although it's indicated that perhaps they haven't seen the last of Mr. Gordon's, because this force can actually assimilate or transform into virtually anything or anyone. So it gives this story that tinge of paranoia that the villain could actually be anywhere or anything. But what happens is Mr. Gordon's actually takes control of a Russian satellite, which is actually containing their latest secret weapon developed during the Cold War, that if things should ever go south, they will use this to essentially sterilize the entire population of the United States using some sort of microwave technology. And this becomes taken over by the super artificial intelligence villain, and then through a series of odd events, winds up finding a temporary henchman in a mad survivalist character, and they essentially go to Earth, and for a point in time, the weapon and spacecraft and villain disguise themselves as a free car wash. And then there's eventually a sequence where Remo and Chiun and Anna go through this car wash of death, but essentially people are being sterilized by the free car wash. That is just a concept in and of itself that is so strange it's hard to even put into words, but that actually does happen in this book. And eventually things culminate in a sort of competitor to Disneyland, basically put a couple miles down the road, that is also made free and is also designed to try and sterilize everyone who comes through it in some sort of mad scheme that has been indoctrinated into the mad villain, and only the Destroyer can stop him. But what complicates matters further is that his master Chiun is essentially not having a good time because he has inadvertently sterilized himself, and this puts him in an even fouler mood. However, this is buoyed slightly by having moments where Chiun actually gets behind the wheel of a car and tries to drive and terrifies everyone, and also gets a credit card and doesn't think of the concept of, you actually have to pay it back. So you get those two wonderful moments sprinkled in this book that is already rather entertaining, rather completely out there, and totally wacky. And if you didn't already realize that Will Murray had a hand in this, at one point there is an aspiring cartoonist character who is trying to come up with characters and actually name checks some of his creations, one of them being Squirrel Girl. And of course, Will Murray was the creator of the actual Squirrel Girl in Marvel Comics just a couple years after this. So Squirrel Girl even appears in this book. So that's my overall experience reading through a handful of books in the Destroyer series and also trying some of the comics. As I said, it's really hard to describe everything you're going to encounter in these books. There are definitely volumes and moments that will, definitely underline that these are not politically correct, especially the earlier ones. But you can also see that after a certain point, the series sort of finds its footing. And if you try a number of different volumes and you find them at least somewhat entertaining or interesting, then you start getting the feeling of, I'm curious. I'd like to read another one of these. And then that becomes another and another and another, and then you find yourself not being able to stop. Now, the series did continue, and apparently after Will Murray left the series, I think around volume 108 or so, I've read in reviews that the more modern books did take a very distinct right-wing turn to them, so I don't really think I'm going to go past the point at which Will Murray left the series, but I am curious to try more of them. And now you can actually, I think the whole series pretty much is available in ebook form or a modern paperback style. But I will say the uniform cover design that they've used for all of these is very generic. So I think I'll just stick with trying to find the vintage paperbacks with the very attention-grabbing covers. And I now look in used bookshops for Destroyers because I can't help myself. They do appear, every once in a while because they sold tons of them during the men's adventure paperback boom. But recently I haven't been able to find any more. And then just the other day I found another one, so I've got another one now, and I can't stop. So again, if that tells you what it's like reading these, once you read a few, you're kind of curious to know more. It's the sort of feeling of I got to read one more. I just have to know. I got to just one more. And one more becomes two, becomes six. So it's truly one of a kind as an experience. And I can completely understand why there is the desire to try and turn it into a film or television series still. I think it could be extraordinarily well done now that we have so many productions that are dabbling in humor and satire with extraordinarily dark edges and high body counts and things. So I think you can see the influence of The Destroyer in a lot of more modern shows especially, but it definitely would require a great deal of thought and consideration about how to translate the madcap elements of the books into a television series or feature films. So I can also understand why it's been in development hell for decades. In any case, I figured now was the perfect time to talk about my dive into the world of The Destroyer for Garbaugust. These books have a certain reputation for those who know them. They have a very dedicated fan base, but also they're not the type of books that most people will admit to reading. They're not considered high literature or anything, but they do have their moments. I will say, when you read a number of them, once the series finds its footing, the prose is engaging, and the best of the series, I think, stands on its own, and they're uniquely enjoyable. There's nothing quite like these. They do satirize the hell out of men's adventure series in terms of 70s and 80s paperbacks, but in the world of The Destroyer, nothing is sacred. Everything will be satirized if it just comes into the orbit of the wacky story that's being told. So I would recommend people try the series if they're interested. Again, I think pretty much the whole series is available in ebook form, and you can go in most any bookstore, and every once in a while there'll be some random Destroyer paperbacks that turn up because there are just so many in circulation. So they are readily available, or you can try the best of volume that I started with, although that will very much give you the full experience of the early books and the distasteful elements you can find in some of those, and then getting into the third book in that collection, which is Assassin's Playoff, and that's really the book that got me firmly interested in the series. So if you were to start anywhere, and perhaps all you've done is seen the 1985 film, I would say start with Assassin's Playoff, book 20, and then just kind of go from there, or frankly, just whatever paperback volume you happen to find in your local used bookstore. So as always, I hope my babblings about the world of pulp fiction has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I really did want to do this since I could think of no better subject to cover for the booktube event of Garbaugust. As always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some Destroyer books if you're interested in checking out the series. Keep reading print books, and thank you ever so much for watching. Oh crap, I forgot to record today's soap opera episode. I have to see if it's on demand or available streaming, because if not, I'm not long for this world.